All right, my friends, it is another Thursday morning and it is time for more about storytelling. On today's episode, it is the sequel episode. We're going back to Astra Crompton to the sequel. Let's go.
Once upon a time,
in a galaxy far, far away,
it was a dark and stormy night.
gather round, my friends. Let me tell you a story.
So, if you think about your favorite stories, what are some of the sequels to them that come to mind that were just as good, if not better, than the original? That is the topic for today's episode that Astra Crompton and I will be talking about, which is sort of a fun thing to do because Astra's second appearance on this podcast, she was my first guest on my very first episode. So not only is she coming back for her sequel interview, but we are both launching sequels to our series this year. I will be releasing Cloudbreaker's Book 2, Peregrine, on June 5th. I'm currently running a Kickstarter for it, so you can get it early in May. And Astra will be launching Battle of Heroes, the sequel of her Prophet's Tale trilogy. Oh my God, worst best friend ever. Anyway, let's not listen to me. Let's listen to her talk about her sequels. All right, and we're back with Astra Crompton to the sequel episode.
Yeah, we love a sequel.
You're number two, Astra. You're a sequel now, my dear. You've expanded the mythos of Astra.
Yeah. Honestly, it just goes hand in hand with every story I write that always ends up bigger than I planned. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Yeah. So not only are you like your sequel returning to the podcast, like this is your second time coming back to the podcast, but also you are just launching or just have launched Battle of Heroes, correct?
Yes. Yeah, it came out on March 26th for World Storytelling Day. And it is the second book in the Prophet's Tale trilogy. So the first book was Legend of the Quill. It came out in 2025. And then the second book came out this year. And then the plan is for the third one to come out same time next year.
So now the world will feel my pain of the gray.
Yes. I'm so excited. Honestly, every time I have to write a gray scene, I just think of you. And I'm like, I hope that this gets the Kenton seal of approval.
Yeah, it makes him shiver. Yeah, that's great. I can't wait for it. Of course, I'm in line for the limited editions, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that what you're calling it? Limited edition?
Yeah, the deluxe limited edition. They're roughly about 250 copies of them, and I'm printing them with a Canadian press called Friesens that does all sorts of beautiful features. And so they're made in Manitoba, which is nice to feature Canadian-made product. But yeah, they have a foil feature on the cover. I've got sprayed edges. I've got a book ribbon. I've got matching headbands. I've got printed end sheets with the world map, and it's got a beautiful dust jacket with a cloth binding with the embossed pattern on that as well. So very excited because the first one was like gold themed and the second one is going to be red because it is a battle, lots of blood. So yeah, it's going to be like red foil and like red sprayed edges and red ribbon and everything. So I think when they're all done, they're going to look really swanky all together.
Oh, I can't wait. I cannot wait. Yeah, because I have Quill. I got the limited edition of Legend of the Quill. And it's, of course, on my library shelf and stuff. And I had to... I'm pretty sure I'm going to order a second copy to read it because I'm reading you for my C for the alphabet challenge.
Right.
And
yes.
I'm like, I feel so bad every time I take your book off my shelf when I finally get a chance to read. And then I got to like take that beautiful dust jacket off. And I'm like so afraid it's going to get wrecked. And
I've definitely done that where I'll just like, while I'm reading it, I'll take the dust jacket off and put it on my shelf just to keep it from getting torn. And so I'll read it without the dust jacket, and then once I'm finished reading, I'll put the dust jacket back on. So it's definitely something that I have done in the past. And also it has a book ribbon, so you don't need to use the flap as like a pseudo bookmark. So it has options.
It has options, which are fantastic options. Yeah. So sequels. Let's talk about sequels for a sec. How have you found the experience of launching the second book in your series? Like, what lessons from your first book did you apply to this new one?
I mean, it kind of breaks down into two categories. So like the pre-production stuff and then the post-production, or I guess like the editing portion versus the like layout portion. Because there are definitely lessons from like a writing and editing perspective. Before I started publishing Quill, I made sure that I had all 3 books drafted. But that does mean that there's still editing that is needed for them, especially based on changes that were made in the previous book, making sure that those are carried through into the second one. Some of that is terminology things that I have updated, characterization pieces that I've updated. There are certain characters that I cut entirely that I have to make sure that they don't randomly crop up places. So that from an editing perspective, there's definitely increasingly more work needed on each subsequent book as I go forward. Part of that is because of the carry through of those changes, but it's also because I have done more drafts on the earlier books. So the one I'm on now, which is the 3rd book in this trilogy, it has the least drafts. I think I'm only on draft 3, whereas like Quill had probably 15 drafts and Battle of Heroes had at least 6. So it's just as I've gone forward, the amount of drafts that they've had has shrunk, which means more work is kind of needed. So for Battle of Heroes, it was kind of in the middle ground of like preparedness in that sense, but it had a really concise plot. So from that standpoint, it was a lot easier from like a pacing perspective, and it was more about the character arcs of each of the POV characters and making sure that those were solid as I carried through. For the 3rd book, working on that one, the character pieces are where the mess is. there's so much mess for like making sure that that ties off. But from a plotting perspective, I'm finding that one is harder to balance because with the first 2, you are kind of given foreshadowing for what their plots are right from the first chapters of the first book. And so those 2 plots are now concluded. And the 3rd one is kind of a harder one to set up because it has to present a whole new plot for the arc of that book, as well as tie off the arc of the main protagonist and antagonist from the very beginning. So it's definitely like a harder kind of challenge because you have a lot more to set up and conclude in one book rather than being able to just tie that off in quote unquote the next book. So yeah, I'm definitely finding some challenges from that side, from the editing side, from a production perspective, from like layout and printing and those sorts of things. I can sum up the lessons that I have learned with give yourself more time than you think you'll need, because so many of those things have ended up having unexpected delays or having like my designer not being available or having like me suddenly having to get surgery. So like when you think you've got enough time planned, like double it at least. And then from like trying to promote a second book, I've definitely found that a higher challenge because you don't necessarily reach the same people with social media or like promotions than you did for the first book. So even if somebody is interested and thinks it sounds interesting, they're not necessarily going to get book 2 if they haven't read book 1. And I especially found that from my ARC readers, so for my advanced reader copies, it was just a way smaller number of people who were willing to sign up for it. Because if they hadn't read book 1, I had a couple people who signed up for it who had not read book 1, and they were like, I don't know what's going on. This world is huge. I don't know what any of these terms mean. And I was like, of course you don't. In my author's note at the beginning of this book, I say, this is not a standalone. I don't recommend you read this if you haven't read book 1. So yeah, I've definitely found there's like a much smaller kind of return for advanced reader copies for the second book if they haven't already followed along from the beginning. So I expect that's probably going to be even more of the case when it gets to book 3.
Yeah, that's wild. It's great to hear some of the things that you said there, because when you were talking about the continuity issues and stuff, like the making sure characters that were removed don't prop up, it always makes me think of like, in movies when, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but all I can think of is like Ocean's 11 when Brad Pitt has like a wine glass and then it's like a champagne glass and then it's a martini.
Yeah. My partner's rewatching Supernatural right now, and because like they've rewatched it a number of times, and so coming back to it years later, and they're like, wait a second, his hands were covered in blood 5 seconds ago. Now they're squeaky clean. What is going on with this editing? So yeah, it's that kind of stuff where it's like if it's blipped there in a moment and gone in like a show or something, some eagle-eyed viewers are going to clock it and some people kind of get amusement out of that. But when it's in a book, I feel like it is going to be a lot more noticeable because you're spending so much more time with it, right? If you're setting up something over 100 pages and then you drop that ball, like all of that work kind of gets washed away. So I feel like there's definitely, you have to be kind of tighter and cleaner when you're trying to do those sorts of carry throughs so that you're the law, right? You're setting all of the rules of this world. And if you break them, then you break the foundation that your reader's trying to stand on. So yeah, definitely trying to be as clean as possible. And I expect that, for me, I work with beta readers where I do my revisions and I run those past my beta readers to make sure that things are coming across the way that I intended. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that's like, you need to know that so you can revise it before it kind of goes out to the wild, to the public. And I think, for the second one, I did kind of 2 rounds of beta readers before I did my final edits. With the third book, I'm probably going to need like at least 2 rounds, maybe more. And that means that I will need more time because they need time to read and to process and to give feedback. And so I'm trying to get my edits done as soon as possible so that they can start reading sooner than they did last year, because that was a bit of a time crunch trying to get everything back in time to actually implement the changes and feedback they had.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and it's great because that's one of the things. One of my editors is turning out to be very invaluable when it comes to the continuity thing. Like I'm currently in the final phases of Peregrine, and he's great because he's got like a working copy, he calls it. He bought a copy of Valen that he can make notes in and break the spine and so it sits flat, and he catches the craziest things. Like it's just it's insane. And I'm like, there's such simple mistakes, simple mistakes.
Well, and sometimes there are things that like don't even like there's the kind of quote unquote mistake pieces that are pretty obvious ones. Like somebody has blue eyes in one chapter and brown eyes in the next chapter, like that kind of inconsistency. For me, my challenge is because I'm dealing with prophecy, that there is a lot of foreshadowing that then comes through, but the nature of prophecy is not necessarily clear, right? Part of the challenge of it is interpreting what does it mean and how do you follow that through in a way that makes things better and not worse. And so part of that is like, you can't just do a keyword search and look for that specific thing necessarily because it won't necessarily be phrased exactly as it happens. So it does require a lot more cross-referencing to make sure that setup and payoff connect the way that they're supposed to, and that the reader can kind of pick up those clues almost like a mystery to figure out kind of where it's going and what it means for the characters.
Well, that's wild. That never occurred to me with what you're writing. How much do you find do you, like when you're writing the prophecy and stuff like that, do you find that you do have very intricate notes? Like, do you spiderweb everything so that you get it right? No,
not at all. The prophecy portions are largely like a flow state. I don't usually remember writing them at all. So when I come back and read them, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, they're kind of the opposite, where they're very intuitive. But I mean, like there is a scene, and I mean, I'm not going to say which one, but for people who have then eventually read book 3, there's a scene in book 1 that is the foreshadowing for book 3. So those pieces are there, and I kind of see them like lights in the distance, and I write towards them. And they're written like I place them into the book when I know what it is I'm trying to set up, but the actual phrasing or the actual iconography or the symbolism that's there is usually more subtle. And those things will kind of come up almost like a theme or a motif that I will hearken back to. So the writing of them is usually very intuitive, but then I use whatever comes out of me in those moments to then build a framework around as I write forward. And that's usually very kind of organically done. It's not something that I'm planning a lot, but when I go back in and I'm doing editing, I'll tighten those things up. If there are too many metaphors in the mix, I will prune some out and keep the strongest ones. And that was something that I did a lot of in Quill, and that I did a lot of again in Battle of Heroes, is trying to strengthen those motifs so that when they happened, they were something recognizable rather than just something that was perhaps distracting for the reader.
Wild. That's wild. So I know you've been working on these books for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah.
How long has it taken you to rebuild them to the current iteration, like between Quill and Heroes coming out now?
Yeah, I mean, the rewriting portion, I really started it in, I guess, February, March-ish, like when Quill was coming out. And then I had to kind of take a pause on that, doing all the promotions and everything. And then I realized I was running out of time and kind of picked it back up in August and was like, okay, I need to get this done. I had it in hands of my beta readers for September, and then got their feedback in time for November, where I implemented all of my edits. And then it was in design in December. So it was pretty madcap. And it was kind of in fits and starts. For this third one, I have been working on it since the beginning of this year, and I'm up to chapter 21 as of today out of like 51. So I'm making good progress, but I did have to take a pause because that's like, I'm a third of the way into the book. I had to take a pause and reverse outline it to make a better plan for this one, because I know that the amount of work that is needed is going to be too hard to crunch into the time that I have, because I'm basically doing a book a year. And so part of that is like building a plan. Okay, what kind of revisions do I need to make? What do I need to tighten up? What pieces do I need to be aware of that are coming up so that I can set that up properly? And I've already gone back and revised some of the earlier chapters that I had already rewritten to strengthen those pieces, but I know I'm going to need to do a second pass of that before it's ready for the beta readers. So yeah, this one has a lot more kind of back and forth that's happening, because there are so many balls in the air to try and juggle the different subplots as well as the character arcs. So there's less characters overall than in Battle of Heroes, but there are kind of more like plot pieces that are in the air. So it's a different approach to the editing of what it is I'm trying to do. And this is one where I might actually, this is a technique I've used for other books, not with the ones within this trilogy, but I think I'm going to pull it out for the third book, which is to read the POV chapters just for one character, to make sure that the forward trajectory for that person's arc is clear and strong. And so that way you're, just kind of reading slices of it. Because this one has like less cast members, it's easier to do that. With Battle of Heroes, there were so many pieces where you couldn't really read their story and make sense of it just reading that one person's POVs, because so much of the view that you're seeing is only a slice of the events that are happening, and so they lose context. Whereas in this one, like some of the characters, like Amincrea, for example, have very strong plot line that is like their plot, that there's something that she's doing and she has her own character arc and she has her own kind of goals. And so it's much easier to kind of peel her away from the rest of the plot that's happening and just see kind of her focal points. So yeah, that's definitely something that I'll probably do before I pass it off, because I think it'll just make it a cleaner product and have, hopefully, cross fingers, hopefully less like really structural changes that will be needed based on the reader feedback.
That's really cool. So in terms of Battle of Heroes, then let me ask you then, what is the part of it that, like this sequel coming out, that you're most excited for the world to experience?
I mean, I think so. The part of the challenge with this trilogy in general is that they have kind of different tones. The first one is an epic quest. Like, that is what it is. If you're looking at like classic, like 1970s fantasy of going on an epic quest and, talking with gods and finding artifacts and all of that good stuff, that's very much the flavor of the first book. And my concern going into Battle of Heroes is that it is a war, and it deals with a lot of the horrors of war. There's a lot more violence. There's obviously a lot more death. There are a lot more fight scenes. There are fight scenes in the first book, but this one, like, that is the focal point, is that it is this big conflict. And so I was hoping that, for one, I didn't lose the kind of character notes of it, because I wanted you to care about what happens to these people that are involved in it, and not just like who lives and who dies, but like the impact of the things that are happening around them, because there is a lot of horror in the second book. And so that tone is quite a bit darker. There are moments that should, in the first book, that should hint that there's more of that coming, but it is kind of a punch. So I worry a little bit that some of the people who liked the quieter kind of moments of the first book may find it too much. So far, the feedback has been really good, and the people who really liked the first book have really liked the second one. So thankfully, they're kind of carrying through with it. But there's going to be that same kind of of shift for the third one as well, which is much more of a political intrigue. So there's a lot less like physical conflict and a lot more like verbal sparring and that sort of thing. So again, there's that tonal shift. But for the second one, like some of my favorite scenes are these they're very horrific. They're horrible things that are happening, but the imagery of that and the impact of that is something that I'm proud of, because I've kept a pretty close view on the action, rather than it being these kind of, sweeping cinematic shots of people charging down a hillside, which I allowed myself one of those. But for the most part, I wanted to keep it really up close and personal. And so, yeah, I hope that resonates with readers.
That's great. Yeah, that's one thing I've always liked about these epic war things is you've got those sweeping down the hillside while the enemy charges, but then I find that war has a much greater impact when you're doing that, like Jon Snow buried under the piling corpses of the armies in the Battle of the Bastards kind of thing. And I feel like that's much more grounded with the personal effect, like you're saying, right?
Yeah, and part of it is like from a sensory perspective, from like a narrative perspective of how you convey what is happening, especially when it is, in this case, second world fantasy. And we're dealing with a lot of monsters and creatures and things that are not something that a human has experienced. And so you've got that double challenge of trying to convey visually what is happening around the characters, because they don't necessarily have touchstones. Like, it's not like it's an elephant, because you're like, okay, what does a new Oten look like? Is that big? Is that heavy? Like, what is, you're having to paint the scene while still having action happens. You can't like stop and give a dissertation on like the creatures around. You have to kind of keep things moving, but evoke enough of the scene to be able to convey the setting as well as the action. And the best way I feel to do that is really through how the characters are reacting to it, through their sensory experience. So keeping close helps to move things along while still delivering the necessary information. But there's also the other side, which is the emotional impact on the reader. And if they don't care about these people, they're not going to care what happens to them or what it is they're trying to do. And so trying to engage enough of, what do they feel about this? And like, is this a loss for them? And like, what are the challenges that they're facing, makes it a lot more relatable for a reader. So even if it's not something, that many of us have experienced, and I mean, you obviously, you've got military experience, so you have experienced some of these things, but for your average reader who hasn't, you still need to pull them in and have them be able to connect with what that experience must be like.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, for sure. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the sensory experiences, because I'm finding with my work with the Cloudbreaker stuff, it's a trap I fall into very often where, I know exactly what this stuff looks like. Mm-hmm. And my characters know exactly what this stuff looks like. They know what it is. But then when I'm trying to describe it to somebody who's never seen it before through the eyes of the character who built the damn thing, right? And it's a trap. It's so easy to fall into where you're just like,
you don't want to go afternoon special of turn to the audience like, well, Bob. You've got to find ways to do it where it's like you're not telling characters something that they would already know, right? But I definitely found that, like, from a sensory perspective, Battle of Heroes had a lot more visceral senses than, I think that a lot of writers default to what do things look like, right? You're trying to create the cinematic. But I think for Battle of Heroes, I did a lot more of like feeling and smell and sound, because there's so much chaos happening, there's so much movement happening, and I have a lot of huge monsters that are kind of beyond the easy visual scope, that it didn't make sense to focus so much on the visual as it did on the ground literally shaking you off your feet as this monstrosity comes towards you. So I played definitely with other senses that maybe are neglected in other scenes or types of scenes. So that was something that was fun to do, like from a writing perspective, was focusing more on the other more visceral senses.
Yeah, which is actually really cool because, like, as you'd mentioned earlier with my experiences, one thing I can say with absolute certainty is in that moment when things go from good to bad, sight is almost always the first sense to go. It right. Just, you narrow your focus, everything goes gray, you get this tunnel vision, and you everything is smell, touch,
Mm-hmm.
hearing, you know, like your sight just
Very
becomes,
primal senses.
yeah. So it's interesting to hear you know, using that in a literary sense. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and for me, like obviously I don't have military experience. For me, my experience comes from martial arts and some of the training that I did where we would do adrenaline stress training, because part of it is like if you're just learning something from a logical standpoint, it's a different part of the brain that reacts than that thinks. And so for
Hmm.
me, the adrenaline stress training was like, yeah, I don't remember the visual, or if I did, it was very pinhole, like everything really tunneled in on like one thing, and I couldn't really, like I lost my peripheral kind of awareness, and it really came down to the physical sensations. So I'm pulling on that a bit when I'm writing kind of fight scenes and stuff, of like that focus being very tunneled. But yeah, I think like it's a good example of where it doesn't necessarily need to be a 1-to-1 ratio as a writer to pull from. Like there are probably things in your, like in the average person's life that you can extrapolate on and be like, okay, in this, in a larger context, like what might the exaggeration of that be? And you know, if you have like a moment of road rage, you can pull from that. Or like if you had a moment of like you're walking down a dark street and you hear feet behind you and you're having that panic moment, like you can pull from those moments to try and like feel and explain what that might be like in the body for these kind of scary or horrific moments happening in a scene.
Yeah, that's very, yeah, fight or flight, like you said, is a very
Yeah.
primal, common thing that everybody can relate to. So when you're writing fantastical creatures and stuff like you have in Battle of Heroes, how much thought did you give to how these things affect them? Like, would any of their, are their sensory experiences different than humans? Did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any POVs in these books that are from the steeds perspectives. I mean, that would be fun to do at some point. But in these books, I don't have any POVs from their perspective, but it does come into play for my species, because the sapient races of this world evolved from different creatures. And so they do
Mhm.
have different sensory abilities. So some of them are able to perceive, like some have better hearing, better eyesight, you know, that they can rely on and be like, do you, like, what is that? Like, you tell me, what is that? There's something moving. I can't see what it is. So part of it is like those sensory perceptions, but I also have like different species have different levels of strength, like their physical capabilities. There are others that you know, are better at more attuned with magic, because I obviously, being a fantasy, second world fantasy, there's a lot of magic as well, and certain species are better at feeling and sensing and recognizing, you know, what magics are happening, which could give them an edge if they can realize what is being cast before it finalizes. But I also have some unknowns that aren't explained until book 3, where they tap into things that they don't understand, that are kind of beyond their comprehension, and that has a cost. So
Hmm.
yeah, so part of it is the different species have different capabilities, and they're definitely, you know, they're for mine, I kind of count it as 6 senses. You have your sight, your smell, your taste, your touch, your hearing, and then you also have the sense of magic, the ability to sense when something has a magical quality. And so that, you know, that kind of like prickle of the hair rising on the back of your neck, that kind of ESP sort of sensation, is basically that sense. It's counted as a separate one. And so some of them have a more honed version of that. Some of them train it. Some of them just inherently have a better grasp of it. But that all comes into play for what they're capable of perceiving.
Wow. That is super cool. So I got to ask, do you have any favorite literary inspirations? Like, are there any authors that you sort of look towards when it comes to how to nail a sequel?
I think probably the best 2 that I have read recently, for just delivery of expectation as a reader. First is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. It was one of those ones that, kind of like mine, each one of the books had a bit of a different flavor, but they all built on the foundation laid out in the first book. And so that was one where like POV was really important. The sensory pieces were really important. And I would say, like, from like a thematic standpoint or like subject matter standpoint, it's nothing like my books, but from a writing skill perspective, that's something that I aspire to. Like Jemisin is masterful. I think probably one of the best writers in speculative fiction living. So
Wow.
yeah,
High
there's always
praise.
something. Oh, honestly, every single choice, like you can see that these are active choices that Jemison made, and they all have such impact. And so yeah, that's something that I strive for in my work, is to try and make sure that all of the choices that I'm making are there for a reason and not just because of the vibes or whatever, or to hit a trope or whatever. I'm like, actually this is for a purpose, is ties in with the larger structure and way that this world works and the way that people will be raised in that setting. So that's one. The other is probably Joe Abercrombie's Age of Madness trilogy. And that one is more of a like kind of industrial revolution era. So very different kind of tone from like the sort of setting and places and things that I'm doing. And he's not doing second world fantasy. It's kind of an alt history sort of fantasy. So in that sense, it's like they're all humans. There are occasionally a weird creature that comes up, but they're not quite not human, I'll put it that way. And so for that one, it's more about the kind of interconnection and interplay between the characters that I think he does really well. Partly for their voices. They all have very distinct voices. A lot of the time, if someone's talking, you can tell who's talking without even any like dialogue tags, because their voices are so distinct. And partly it's just how interwoven everything is, because he'll do a lot of play with character where you'll know who a character is, but another character won't know who they are, and he'll use little visual cues about what they like, having a hat on, a curly hair, where you're like, oh, I know who that is, that's Hildy. And so he'll use these little like visual cues of like just a line, just a word even sometimes, of who that person is, where the reader then gets clued in on who they're talking to or who they're fighting, but the character doesn't understand the impact of what they're doing. The reader is the only one who does. And so that's kind of a fun way of kind of nudging the reader to trust their intelligence, to trust that they're going to pick up the connections between things, but also just from a he's not afraid to have characters have arcs that just plummet into the gutter. You know, he'll sometimes lift them up only to absolutely crush them, and he does it really, really well. And he has some of my favorite of all time characters, and they kind of get their finale in that trilogy. And so it was really satisfying to have followed them for books and books and books and kind of see where they ended up. So yeah, those two I think are probably the ones that currently are riding highest in my heart. But I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily like inspired by them for what I write, but more so how I approach writing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which is important. I mean, what you said about Jamison. How did you say the name?
I hope I'm pronouncing right. Yeah, N.K. Jemisin. Yeah.
M.K. Jemison. I'm just trying to cycle it through my tongue so that I can remember it and not screw it up later. But like what you said about them when it came to the way that they're, building their continuity with different flavors in each book, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think the reason that I like it so much is because I don't see a lot of that. There's, especially from like the commercial, like big 5 publishers, if something does well, then they just want more of that, right? And sometimes to the point where now they're just publishing, fanfic. Literally, they're publishing fanfic and promoting it as fanfic, which is wild to me. Whereas I feel like N.K. Jemisin writes what she wants to write. And there's no quarter given, I guess, for what is going to be marketable or whatever. And her writing's just so good that not only has she kind of quote unquote gotten away from it, from the corporate machine, but she's also won so many awards for it. So she's clearly doing something right. And for me, I'm starved for more original, unique content like that, because I find so much of, especially in speculative fiction, is derivative, because we're all inspired by things and they seep into our work. But the trick is to really garden that into something that is new and fresh, rather than just like, oh, well, I want to write that kind of book, so I'm just going to write my own characters, but it's more of the same. Whereas everything in her books is like, this is a unique world that I have never seen before, and I just want to like sink into it, because every little detail is something something new and fresh, and it's like traveling, where you just get to go to a country that you've never been to before and you know nothing. So you got to learn the language, you've got to taste the food, you've got to learn the local culture, the religion, or whatever. And I love that. I want to be transported, and that's why I love speculative fiction so much. Is it gives me the opportunity to experience things that I've never experienced, to think about things from a different perspective that I hadn't maybe considered, and just to decenter myself in fiction. I want to forget that I exist. I want to forget I have a meat sack and just be able to seep in this world that I'm presented. And Jemison does that really well.
Wow. Yeah, you're making me want to go try to find some of their books and
there's so many good ones. I'm reading one right now, and it's completely different, but it still has all of those same hallmarks of the writing that I love. So it's really nice when you can kind of find a writer that is like consistently able to deliver the things that you like.
Yeah. You said one thing I want to go back to revisit that you said that kind of broke a thought for me is when you were saying that sequels and stuff in the Trad 5, the Big Five and all that, they want more of the same, Mm-hmm. When you said that, it dawned on me that I think that is my biggest problem with the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. Mm-hmm. I felt like in like the first or second round, I'm like, I guess, what phase? Is it, the first or second phase? Yeah, thank you. That's the word I was looking for. You remember, like, so out of the entire MCU, my favorite movie of all time is Captain America: Winter Soldier. As mm-hmm. my favorite. And I, again, because, I'm as a military enthusiast and stuff, I really enjoyed that, that whole military aspect and the whole spy movie kind of mythos of it. But it felt so much different than all the other movies. It felt like back mm-hmm. in the day when I used to read Captain America comics and then I go back to X-Men, they felt different. Mm-hmm. But I find the new modern ones, like the later phase since Endgame, everything just feels the same, but dressed in different clothing.
Yeah, and there are some exceptions to it, but they seem to be relegated, or I say relegated, but I think that it's actually a really good format for them, to the miniseries, whereas some of the more experimental and some of the more fun ones that they've done have been the like miniseries, like WandaVision, like Agatha All Along, even the Loki series, where they played with format a lot more, and they've played with tone and even with just the visual presentation of it, because a lot of the big kind of like Avengers Assemble films have gotten very like, it's the same kind of slightly desaturated color palette, and everything's a little bit gritty, and everyone's like super like Hollywood photoshopped to be very beautiful in whatever metric, and it kind of loses a bit of, and this might sound funny talking about superhero films, but it loses a bit of reality, right? It loses some entry point for you to care. And I don't remember who said it, but I came across something recently where they said that if you make something with a distinct point of view, it is not for everyone. And I think that when it comes to big companies that are investing a lot of money in something, they want it to kind of touch on the vastest number of people, which means it has the least point of view. Because by doing so, by trying to make it palatable for the largest number of people, you don't take a risk and say something that might lose some of them or offend some of them. And we are seeing a lot of that in fandom, where a lot of dudes are crawling out of the woodwork to be harassing to female heroes for those MCU pieces, or like in the Star Wars universe of harassing people of color for being included. So trying to appease everyone is never going to, because those people can only center themselves. Whereas if you make something that is distinct and specific and for a more targeted group, you have the opportunity to make something really great. And if it's great, then people will come in and love it anyways. So yeah, I think that rather than trying to please everyone, I would rather focus on a smaller group and do it well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because it's like, to me, I keep thinking about the separation of church and state and how that kind of leans into this. I really do believe that commercialism and art need to be separated too, because I think art suffers when you start to apply capitalism.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for the point of like cotton candy media where it's just there to be fun and it's just there, to have you turn your brain off and just have a nice time, there's definitely a place for that. I don't think there's anything wrong to have that kind of media available, but I think that trying to make that be the status quo and that should be the bar and that anything that tries to go past that is like it's dumbed down, or they're adding subtitles, or they're now with like the kind of Netflix effect where people are literally just telling their plot to the audience because they're expecting you are only 30% paying attention while doing your laundry or whatever. Like that kind of dumbing down, I think, is harmful to art. And we've most recently had Andy Weir say that he didn't try and put anything political in his books. He just wants, Romulans and the Federation to shoot at each other. And I'm like, guy, that is political. That was a Cold War analogy, right? Like, so you can't really remove real world issues from media because the people who are watching it are living in that world and they're going to react to it based on their experiences. Yeah. So it's one thing to say like, I don't want to weigh in on subjects that I don't have any experience in. I think that's valid. But to try and claim that your stories, if they have any plot at all, have no points of view is, I think, disingenuous as a storyteller.
That's great. That's great. That's a quote right there.
I mean, you can't.
That's gonna go.
I'm not going to say you can't write a story without point of view. I'm sure that somebody has done some experimental fiction, but even that choice of removing point of view is a choice, right? That is a point of view to have. So, I think that to tell a story, you need to take one. You need to have a character that has a stance and has beliefs, and you don't necessarily have to agree with them. And just because you have a terrible character that does terrible things doesn't mean that you as an author believe or espouse those things. But I think that you do need to handle them with critical thinking and with conscientiousness of how that might affect readers and what kind of point you're trying to make with it.
Wow. Boom. Mic drop. Astra with the mic drop.
Just throws it down.
So for the fun of it, let's talk sequels in pop culture.
Okay.
Favorite pop culture sequel, go.
I mean, it might be nostalgia speaking, but for me, it's Terminator 2 and Aliens. I think, and the reason I bring these two up is because I enjoyed Alien and I enjoyed Terminator, but I think that those two sequels were even better than the first one, and that rarely happens. You'll often get a sequel that is as good as the first one. You'll more often get a sequel that's not nearly as good, and you can tell it was like a cash grab and it didn't really land. And sometimes it's not even a case of like bad artistry, it's just a case of timing. So, for example, like Incredibles 2 didn't land because by the time they made it, we had a bazillion Marvel films. And so the expectation and appetite for superhero films had totally changed the media landscape. And so things that worked so well in the first one just like didn't have the wow factor, didn't have the impact that the first one did. And it wasn't necessarily a bad film, but like timing wise, it just no longer worked. Whereas with Terminator 2 and Aliens, they both took the things that were good about the first one and really honed in on them and took like a really strong focal point and did some really interesting things with them and asked some interesting questions. So yeah, I think those two still stand up. I mean, I rewatch them every few years and I'm like, yeah, this is still great. So
yeah,
that for me lasts.
Yeah, interesting too, because I think they're both James Cameron, aren't they?
I think they are. I mean, to be fair, at some point he talked with a Crossroads demon and was like, I'm going to make films that will be classic films. Whether they're good or not, they're going to be family classics. I don't know what deal he made, but he definitely did.
I think his deal ran out, though, because like Avatar Way of Water, I was not impressed at all. Like the first movie, obsessed with it. But
yeah,
when Way of Water, I haven't even watched what's the new one? Fire and Ash?
No, I haven't seen the second or third ones. I have a friend who's obsessed with them. And it's one of those things where, like, from a world building perspective, like, Pandora is beautiful. Like the world
Oh,
building
for
is
sure.
so thoughtful and so gorgeous, and so I think that like being able to kind of exist in that world is something very special, and especially with it being like one of the few 3D films that was actually filmed properly in 3D, where everything had depth rather than just like twice in the movie something jumps out at you, which is what a lot of the 3D ones did. That has so much merit, but the plots have never been strong. Even for the first one, the plot's kind of a Pocahontas ripoff, you know, and not to say
Yeah.
Pocahontas is great and
Pocahontas
certainly
in
not
space.
historically accurate, but it has some of those problems. So
Yeah.
so from a standpoint of production, it's beautiful, but the plots have never been great. So having missed them on, you know, the full 3D experience, I was not in a hurry to watch them on my small screen at home. But I would like to see
Yeah.
them at some point, if only for the world building, because that is something to tip a hat at.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's part of why I didn't like the second one is like the first one showed us things we'd never seen before. And it was
Yeah.
jaw-dropping, you know, like the
Yeah.
floating mountains and the
Mm-hmm.
cool military versus biological stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
I loved all of that. And then the second one came along and it was the exact same thing, but in the water instead of the jungle.
Yes.
Same
Yeah.
plot, same everything, right down to
Exactly.
the rehashed lines like, this is what pays for all your science. Like, come on, man. Like, really?
And that's a perfect example of where it's just more of the same, right? This did so well, so we just need to give them more of whatever it was that they liked. And I find that is, I find that lazy. You know, it's kind of, if somebody is like, I want your money, I'm like, well, I don't want to give it to you just because you want it. Like, I just feel that
Yeah.
sometimes those like, and not to say that they didn't put a lot of time into it, because like the production for those is such a huge budget, but it's disappointing for all of that artistry to go in there and them to not really have a backbone to hold it.
Yeah, I was. That's like I say. It was sad. It was upsetting to me and stuff because, like I said, I was a huge fan of the first one, and I went into the second one with high hopes, thinking I was going to see new things, and it was just when it was rehashed, I was like, ugh.
I got to go to the World of Pandora and Disney World, and it was so cool because it was all of the best parts of like, these are the sets, the floating mountains, and like they had one of those rides where you get to have like the 4D experience where you've got the surround sound visual and like the VR kind of headset, and then they're basically like motorcycles that you ride for the ride, but they had like built in like air bladders so that you could feel the beast breathing under you, and they have the mist spray and stuff. It was the coolest experience. I was like, I don't care about anything else, I'm just going on this ride on loop. But that kind of stuff, right? That thought and that planning that went into like all of those little details, like that's the beauty of what they've created. And unfortunately they didn't really give it anything to do with the world that they built.
What a bummer. Yeah, like I can't think honestly of better sequel examples than you already gave. Like I'm trying to rack my brain of like twos that I really liked. But unfortunately for me, most of the movies I've really, really, really loved in my life that made super big impacts on me as a storyteller never got sequels. So
yeah, and to be fair, a lot of the ones that like are brilliant pieces of storytelling are ones that should not have sequels. Like I think of like Requiem for a Dream is one of the best construction film production like films that I've ever seen, and it's just like, no, that is it. It doesn't need anything else. It is like start to stop. It is perfect storytelling, and that's it. You don't need a second one. So I think that I've actually been enjoying a lot of the shorter form like 8-episode series and stuff that we've been getting, because I feel like they often give you the opportunity to have much tighter storytelling, because it's not an episodic medium. Like it's not intended to just be, we're going to have these characters interact in some way to fill up more episodes. There is like a set plot, but it's also something where it's like you have to get it done in a short amount of time. So you get more time to explore than just a film, but you also don't have the old 26 episode seasons or 52 episode seasons. And so you have to really be honed in. You don't have a filler episode. You have to just get your story told. So I have been really appreciating a lot more of that kind of content as a good like media analogy for writing, because it, I think, more closely mimics the kind of pacing and delivery that book storytelling needs to take. Because sometimes it's difficult to translate other media that you love, like an album or a video game, into book format, because the things that make it so good in that format don't necessarily translate to the page. Whereas some of those like shorter form, like mini series, I think they do more closely kind of translate into book storytelling. So there's been a few of those I've been watching recently that I've really appreciated.
Wow, that is really cool. What are really cool? So I think that's a really good place to end it, because I'm just looking at the time here and we're getting pretty close to the hour mark. So, game time.
Okay.
Game time as it goes. So one more question. You're familiar because this is Astra 2, the sequel. So let's go with. Are you ready? All right. As you were mentioning about Battle of Heroes earlier, prophecy is something that you've been dealing with in your books, the foreshadowing and the navigation through tumultuous events in a safe manner. What prophecy about the current world that we live in do you wish we could have listened to 50, 60 years ago?
Oh, I have a perfect one. So, reading Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, there was a footnote in the book where he says, if we continue using coal at the rate we are going, we will run out in 200 years. And if you look at the calendar and then you look at the state of the world right now, that's pretty damn pathetic.
Well done, Jules Verne, prophet of science fiction.
Right? So yeah, it's interesting. I read a lot of historical fiction, and that's one of the reasons that I really like to, because I find that we often think, oh well, it's outdated and it has no relevance, whatever, to modern life. But there's so many pieces from a sociological perspective, or even like that, like a prediction perspective, that even if they're not correct for what life ended up being like, we don't have jets and flying cars, but they still have a perspective on where they thought life was going. And I think that right now, with the way that the world is, we need more of that, like, well, what do we want the future to look like rather than what do we think it will look like? Because if we just look at it from a dystopian lens of like everything's going to hell in a handbasket, then that is what we expect as the norm. We don't try and deviate from that. We don't try and make it better. And what I would love to see more people doing is like, okay, if the system is on fire, we need to build a new one. What do we want it to look like? And that, I think, if we can have more people having those conversations of like, if this is broken, rather than just trying to put another Band-Aid on it, we have the opportunity now to pivot. And we could choose anything. So what do we want to choose?
Oh, man. Awesome. Best answer you could have given. And I got to give you mega massive bonus points, like 100,000 mega bonus points to Astra for quoting Jules Verne, who is the father of steampunk, the genre I write in.
Oh, honestly, Jules Verne is great. There's so much good stuff in Jules Verne. I encourage people who like speculative fiction to go back and read some of the like OG writers in this genre, because there's some really cool stuff that isn't just like the famous ones that people have forgotten. Like Out of a Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis is also another really cool sci-fi.
I've never
like
heard
people
of that
think of
one.
him. I know, right? Everyone thinks of Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, but yeah, Out of a Silent Planet, really cool book, and one of the ones that's like not talked about, but there's some good ones out there. So I try and dig through some of the old classics, because sometimes I don't know why society clung on to certain writers or certain books of theirs when they had a lot of other work, and maybe some of those is somebody's new favorite.
Yeah, and maybe too, because it's also my forte, and I'm a bit biased when I say this, but short form some of authors' short forms are just like read short stories, man. Like Isaac Asimov, I rant about this a lot, but Isaac Asimov, you know, a lot of people know him for I, Robot and the Foundation trilogy. But his Nightfall and other stories, his collection of short stories, that story Nightfall, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Honestly, some of the like pieces of media that have kind of stuck with me the most are those kind of short form pieces, because they're just an idea. Like, you don't have time to dig into it in a deeper standpoint. So the whole point of a short story is just exploring one idea. And so those are great places to get inspiration from, because you can take that further of like, if this, then what, right? Like, then what does that look like? So it's also less of a time investment. So if you find that you don't like it, then whatever, there's gonna be a new story in 2 pages. It's, you know, it's fine. Right? For those people who have like a shortened attention span in our modern day and age, like short stories are the way to go. Then if you don't want to dive into like a book's like doorstopper tome, you can definitely dig into some short story collections.
Finish 1 or 2 in a bus ride.
Right. I mean, I always miss my stop if I'm reading a short story collection on the bus, but yeah.
Oh man. All right. So Astra, Battle of Heroes out now.
Battle of Heroes out now. Yeah, we've got the regular paperback, casebound, and ebook are all available, which you can find on my website. And then the special edition, hopefully we will have those by June. I'll be join my newsletter. I'll be posting updates on when they're available. The pre-orders are currently open, and people who are signing up for the pre-order are getting a free bonus short story of content that was cut from Battle of Heroes. So if you want access to that, come give me a follow and see all the fun stuff that I'm doing.
And that's
www.astracrompton.com.
Yes, that's I wanted to make sure. That's why I stopped to let you finish.
Yeah, you bet.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And always too on Instagram and everything else, it's at Ulzarith, correct?
It is. So that's ULZAORITH, which is the world that these books take place in.
Yeah. So make sure you follow Astra. She's fantastic. And pick up her sequel, Astra to the sequel.
And thank you so much for talking with me today. It's always a pleasure.
Aw, anytime, buddy. And that wraps us up for another week of More About Storytelling. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard here, please like, follow, share, tell others about it. And thank you for your support. Thank you for sticking along the journey. I hope you're getting something out of it and learning about some really cool people. If you would like to be a guest on the show, please go to my website, www.kentonjmoore.com, and fill out the contacts form. So, hope to hear from you. Talk to you next Thursday.
Fade to black. The end.